But first of all, Ambassador Chris Hill. Thank you.
Well, Mark, thank you. Mark, thank you very much for those very kind remarks. I got to say, though, it's very kind of you to say that it was a coup for the University of Denver. I tell you, you don't have to spend too much time in this city to have a look at those mountains and realize this is a city that kind of sells itself. I mean, it is an extraordinary place to live. It is a vibrant place. It's a place that has really embraced globalization in many respects. I mean, from the minute you arrive at that airport, I mean, you're in a place where you can sort of feel a part of the rest of the world. So I had never been to Denver before. I'm from New England, which is why sort of like my introduction's a little less inflated. But I've had trouble moving over to the Broncos, but I'm still working on that. Yeah. I mean, we're used to young quarterbacks who are 38 years old, not 39, so it's been hard to watch the Broncos in this sort of setting sun mode that they've been in. Don't worry, they're going to do fine this year. They'll win a lot of 8 to 9 football games. Yeah. So, first of all, I want to just congratulate Fred for this leadership forum. I think this is really, it's a subject that has bedeviled many people through the world. I mean, it is an elusive concept, what really is leadership, what it is and what it is not. Mark was very kind to mention my ambassadorships, but I can tell you I didn't learn about leadership being an ambassador. I kind of got a sense of it being a Peace Corps volunteer when I was 22 years old. And I remember, my job was I went around to these 28 village and plantation credit unions, a little country called Cameroon. And they gave me a Suzuki 125 dirt bike, put an adding machine on the back. It wasn't exactly Easy Rider to have an adding machine on the back of your motorcycle, but I went around and audited their books, and I found one credit union where the board of directors, being about 10 people or 15 people, and a credit union of 600 people, had kind of made off with some 50% of the loans. I mean, the loans were accounted for, but they weren't really covered. And it was, 50% in such a loan concentration. So I went in front of that credit union leadership. I didn't mince any words. I went right to the heart of the matter. I said, these people have far too many loans, far too much of your money. And people kind of stood up and thanked me for raising this injustice, this indignity, really. Then many people would kind of turn their remarks to the board of directors, who were not very happy with me that day, and they were kind of wagging their finger at this board of directors. And so I was really pleased. I mean, I'd come out of college, just a few weeks before, and there I was, pointing out these problems in a place called Buea, Cameroon. And of course, I didn't leave anything to them to decide. So I formed what I felt was a reform board. I found some people who really, a local school teacher, for example, and I set up my whole reform board. And so I said, we need an election here. And everyone said, that's wonderful, thank you so much, you really brought so much here. And I sort of sat down, the sense of I had really made a difference. And then they proceeded to vote the old guys back in, to about 95%. And so I realized I didn't know anything about that. And I didn't know anything about what constitutes leadership of a credit union, and certainly what constitutes what people think about what they need for leaders. Do they need someone who, takes care of, or is concerned about loan concentrations? Evidently not. Do they need someone who, they trusted from maybe some family situation or people that they knew very well? Maybe it was something like that. And so I felt it was very important. I learned at that tender age of 22, due respect to any 22-year-olds in the audience here, you know very little about life. And And I thought to myself, I'm never going to let this mistake happen again. I am never going to presume to choose someone else's leaders. They're going to have to figure it out themselves. And so the best you can do in sort of talking about leadership is talking to people about how they might frame and think about what kind of leaders they want. Do they want leaders who are brave? Well, bravery can be a good thing, but when combined with stupidity, it can be a real problem. So you got to be a little careful about that brave and stupid leader. Do you want someone maybe who's got some wisdom? And I think we all have to understand in this information age, and I think it was Kant who pointed this out some 200 years ago, that information does not equal knowledge, and knowledge does not equal wisdom. It takes a while to get to that sort of third phase of what you've got to do, because sometimes it will be necessary to move, and sometimes you need to show the wisdom to hold back and understand that that may not be what you want to do. Clearly, I think a leader needs clear goals. I mean, that's pretty much out of every paperback book you've ever seen at an airport, that a good leader has clear objectives out there. But I think beyond that, a good leader needs not only clear objectives, but needs to believe in those, needs to be able to impart them to others, and maybe most importantly, needs to have a sense of optimism that follow me and we're going to get this done. And optimism, so how do you teach optimism? Well, you don't want a dumb optimist either, because they can lead you in the wrong direction. But I think it should be somehow the sum total of the objective circumstances of what those goals are and how they can be achieved. I must say, and I've written a book, I think Mark alluded to it, which is a book about my time as a diplomat. And by the way, I pick it up in the Peace Corps, because people always ask me what my most important assignment was, and I usually go back to either being a junior officer or a Peace Corps volunteer, because that's, I think, when you really see some of these issues. But I think anyone who's ever had to make a decision with enormous consequences for others, and without the help of being able to sound out the decision with others and kind of figure out, is this the right way to go, but who actually experiences not only a sort of loneliness at the top, as many leaders experience, but also just plain loneliness. You don't have someone else you trust to bounce that idea off of and get kind of the right vibes about that idea. So this idea of making decisions and not having the comfort of having a lot of people around you whose judgment you trust, who will say, yeah, that's the right way to go. And I think that's kind of gets at some of the leadership that I talk about in the book from my experiences in the Foreign Service. I must say, as we sort of broaden the scope, if you look at some of the things our country's leaders have had to face in recent years, and then you realize that showing leadership, even trying to impart this sense of optimism that I think is so important, doesn't necessarily find fertile ground. I mean, we have a country where finding fault in people is sort of more popular than the NFL these days. Even in the NFL, watch those Monday morning shows. It's amazing the capacity of people to find fault in the decisions of others. So part of leadership is to absorb some of the criticism. You can't ignore it, because some of it's important to understand and to make yourself a little better at the next time. But you can't be weighed down by it, and you cannot be guided by it, because a lot of the people who make this kind of criticism have never made a decision in their lives. They've never had to lead people, and they've certainly never had to lead people in life or death situations. So you have to kind of be careful about taking this all in. And I mention this because as I speak to you today, there's a lot going on in a far-off little country called Syria. It's been going on for 4 years. I think what happened was that some 4 years ago, there was something called 4.5 years ago, there was something called the Arab Spring, or more accurately, the Arab thing, because it really had nothing to do with spring. And in fact, we still don't know what it had to do with. Zhou Enlai famously said to Richard Nixon in Shanghai back in 1972, in answer to the question, what do you think of the French Revolution? And Zhou Enlai said, well, it's really too early to tell. And so I think we could still say that in some respects about the Arab Spring. But I think what we now know, it was a very complex process. It was different in various countries. It certainly reflected people's anxiety and people's upset about their own leaders. But the result of it, that is to take down these leaders, was not to create space for a more democratic culture, as many people had hoped. I mean, to see the New York Times just cheerleading this thing like it was a football match or something. You know, the New York Times had people in the square in Egypt and in Cairo. But I think it's clear now that what happened was you took off this authority, this nation-state authority, and some of these people were well past their shelf life. I'd certainly put Hosni Mubarak as someone who probably should have left the scene earlier. But you take off this sort of authority that had been there for a long time, and you expect some uprising of democracy, and what you got were people taking refuge in other forms of loyalty and protection. And so people don't necessarily say, well, thank God that leader's gone, now we can go ahead and build a democracy. Often instead what they're really doing is they say, my goodness, we don't have the protection of the nation state here, the state that has been around for a long time. We're going to have to find protection in tribal or even sectarian identities, and I think we've seen a lot of that in the Middle East. And so we've had a kind of open hunting season on any sort of traditional leader there, and the consequence has been that it's kind of a free fire zone in many of these countries. That's sort of the result today. I think we can see that, you know, as hideous and, you know, as awful as the sort of murderous buffoonery of Muammar Gaddafi was, I think people are hard-pressed to say Libya is a better place today. Doesn't mean that we should long for the day of Gaddafi, but I think analytically speaking, it's probably not a lot better in Libya than it was under Gaddafi. And in some respects, in terms of the task now of building some kind of functioning society, that task may be even greater than the task had been to try to convince Gaddafi to join in the building of a functional society. Difficult as that was, he was a hard person to convince of anything. And so we end up with a situation that's arguably worse. And so when you look at what happened in Egypt, the administration, the United States, had worked with Mubarak for many decades. Now, Mubarak would not be a poster child to any democracy-minded non-governmental organization. I doubt he was invited to Human Rights Watch annual Christmas party or anything. But he kind of kept the lid on. It wasn't pretty. In fact, it was at times very ugly. When we wanted some terrorist taken off the scene, he would say, well, just give me a roll of duct tape and I'll wrap them up, put them in the back of a car, and we'll deliver them. The Egyptians did that for years. Not pretty stuff, not stuff that we necessarily need to be proud of, because some of these people were abused before even being accused. But he was nonetheless someone who had been a kind of friend of the United States, for better or worse. And the fact is, the United States was therefore, because they saw this guy as a friend, often as a friend who didn't really know how to behave at times, but nonetheless someone who felt he was acting in sort of loyalty to the United States. The consequence was that we were a tad bit slow to say Mubarak must go. Frankly, Mubarak had to go. I think the Egyptian people were making it pretty clear. We were a little slow. And of course, the administration being second guessed, why did you do that play? Why didn't you run the running play or something? So the administration just took a lot of heat for being a little slow on Mubarak. Lo and behold, a couple of months later, situation flares up in Syria, and by golly, we're not going to be too slow on this hideous guy Bashar al-Assad. In fact, Assad never did us any favors. We need to be much quicker, so let's get Assad out. Let's say we won't deal with him. Let's say we need democracy in Syria. Well, Assad, he wouldn't go. He wouldn't leave. And I think when you look at some of these dictators, and I've spent a lot of time with them, I mean, I don't think Milosevic and I were ever friends, but I mean, I knew the guy. These are stubborn people. That's why they're there. And so the consequence was Assad, he didn't say, well, gee, let me get my hat and coat and I'll be out of here. He stayed. And if you look at Syria, if you look at it, if you analyze it, if you tell people, hold on a little, let's try to understand this situation a little better, an unpopular thought, but a leader needs to express that thought. If you look at this situation a little more closely, you see why Assad continues 4 years later to enjoy the support of many Christians, enjoys the support not only of his Alawite tribe, but of the Druze as well. In fact, enjoys the support of some of the Sunnis who have largely banded together in a way to try to overthrow Assad, but albeit in very different configurations. There are Sunnis who are in ISIS, there are Sunnis who are in Al-Qaeda, and then there's the moderate opposition. The search for the moderate opposition, which is taking on a sort of comical look right now. So anyway, Assad wouldn't leave, and we were left with a policy because we were pushed, we the United States, we were pushed by all, people in the U.S. who said, you're so slow with Mubarak, why are you, allowing this thing to go on in Syria? So we pushed to get rid of Assad. The consequence is we cannot talk to anyone in Baghdad. Our ambassador, along with the French ambassador, and God bless the French, but I don't remember ever doing a sort of bilateral with the French in a place like Syria. He goes down to Hama. Hama is a hotbed of radical Sunni sentiment under something called the Muslim Brotherhood. They weren't necessarily being violent at the time, but they were certainly, having different viewpoints on everything. And we encouraged them to get together and oppose Assad. Well, lo and behold, the people in Damascus, namely Assad, wouldn't talk to us anymore. Done, finished, no more discussions with Americans. Now, there are times when you want to say to a dictator, we'll never deal with you anymore and you got to get out of here. And so you're backing away from the person. But when you back away, you better have some concept of where you're going. Because walking backwards can be very dangerous and you can find yourself falling off a cliff, and that's what's happened. If you look at Syria today, if you look at the major players in Syria today, U.S. foreign policy has arrived at a situation where we cannot talk to anybody. We cannot talk to the government in Damascus because we said he has to go. And anytime our Secretary of State, John Kerry, has introduced the slightest bit of nuance to that, he's immediately attacked as backtracking on our pledge never to deal with Assad. Beautiful. But we also can't deal with the al-Nusra Front, because essentially they are an al-Qaeda affiliate, and we certainly are not going to deal with ISIS. So who are the other players in Syria? Hard to find any. There is the so-called moderate opposition. But who is a moderate in Syria today? In fact, how would you even identify a moderate today? Would you, for example, circulate a questionnaire? First one being, how do you feel about yourself? A, moderate. B, very moderate. C, crazy moderate. I mean, how would you even identify moderates? The consequence, frankly, without belaboring the point, is we don't have anyone to talk to, and therefore we should not be surprised when the Russians come in who have a clear objective, which is to keep this murderous Assad in power, and the Russians have been able to negotiate a deal where the government, the government in power says, Russians, if you want to create an air base, if you want to put troops on the ground, you have our permission. Who's on more solid ground in international law terms? At this point, probably the Russians. We are bombing targets against ISIS, just as Russia started to do today, although with the Russians, you never know what they're going to hit, and neither do they. So, I mean, God bless them, but you know, we've been through this before. And so we have a situation where Russia is a bigger player than we are. So there are many Americans who say, this is all about our president. You know, if he were only a tougher leader, this wouldn't have happened. And I submit to you, it's far more complicated than that. We have a president who, frankly, whatever people think about him, I mean, we're into this, the last year, almost the last year of the presidency. He's obviously a thoughtful person. I mean, he's a thoughtful person. He cares about these issues. He studies these issues. To some extent, he almost thinks out loud. He gives thoughtfulness a bit of a bad name among some people, but this is not someone who makes mistakes, rushes into things, or doesn't listen to other points of view on it. So why do we have an administration that's kind of been unable to kind of figure this thing out? And I think you have to widen the scope. If you want to cast blame at this president, how about looking at this political opposition we have in this country that has absolutely no clue what it wants to do, and in fact, kind of falls back in generalities. Well, if only our president showed more leadership. Okay, Mr. McCain, what kind of leadership would you like apart from starting World War III? What do you have in mind for this, for us to do? And then you find that the opposition in this country essentially changes the subject and won't discuss it further. In short, we have failed as a country, not only as an administration, but also in our opposition, to come together to understand that these international relations issues do require leadership, but it has to be leadership from our entire political leaders, not just from a president who's going to be second-guessed even with a Mother's Day proclamation. So I think we've got a big problem, and what I'm increasingly seeing in this country is a willingness to take opinions without taking responsibility for what those opinions mean. And that is, to me, the absence of leadership. If you cannot take an opinion that has some consequence. For those people today blaming the Hungarians for the refugee crisis, you know, Hungary, okay, they didn't perform too well, did they? I mean, but I was in Macedonia during the Kosovo War. Macedonia is a country of about 1.9 million people, and lo and behold, 500,000 Albanians showed up at their border. What do you think the Macedonians thought of that? Do you think they thought, oh, it's a great idea that you're bombing Serbia and bombing Kosovo so that we can house all the refugees? Beautiful, happy to do it. No, that's not how they felt, and it's certainly not how the Hungarians felt, because the Hungarians had nothing to do with Syria policy. I mean, you know, I like Hungarians, but I don't think they have really any great insights on Syria. But what they've been is sort of the new country that has been attacked for how they've managed the whole refugee issue. My own view is, if you want regime change, and if, realistically speaking, that regime is not going to say, well, okay, I got it, I'm out of here, what you're also saying is, by asking for regime change, you're also saying, I'm willing to put up with a war. And when you're willing to put up with a war, because it's a logical extension of regime change, because these guys don't leave on their own, if you want a war, then you are accepting the proposition that they're going to be refugees, because show me a war and I'll show you refugees. There has rarely in history been a war without refugees. And so then to turn that into some sort of, gee, those Hungarians, they don't understand their responsibilities according to, you know, the UN Charter, beautiful. But my view is, if you wanted that war, you should be prepared to host a refugee family in your living room, because these refugees are an inevitable consequence of this war. Now, fortunately, I think the European Union is trying to manage this, trying to take the pressure off some of these countries on the border of these troubles. Certainly, with respect to Macedonia, when we had that, we managed a program by which many refugees were flown to places like Norway and even the United States. So, you know, eventually the international community comes around to trying to be helpful. But certainly, in the meantime, it is very tough for countries to receive this kind of criticism without receiving any kind of assistance. So I think a part of leadership that to me is very important in this international sphere is to understand that you cannot just talk and expect there to be no consequences of your talk. So I think there has to be in leadership an effort really to bring this country together. We used to have the very quaint notion that politics stops at the water's edge. Believe me, right now, politics just gets going at the water's edge. And I think we need to also understand that these are complex problems. And if you see problems in a sort of Manichaean good versus evil, you're probably in the wrong line of work. You probably ought to go work in a monastery or someplace like that. If you just want to see everything in good and evil without the enormous shades of gray in between, you're really not cut out for handling these tough issues. There is no question that Assad is a brute. Assad is no one that we want in the final analysis running Syria. Is that really the way to start? In the Dayton Peace Accords, something that is a sort of fuzzy, distant memory for many people today, but it was 20 years ago. It was 20 years ago this month, or October, that we started. What happened was, for 3 weeks, and I worked on this very directly with my boss, Richard Holbrooke, my mentor. Everyone needs a mentor, but often mentors are also tormentors, and he was both. But after some 2.5 weeks of Dayton, with a few days to go, we walked into Milosevic's suite at Dayton, and we kind of laid out where we were. We had a territorial map. We had an understanding of how the internal map of Bosnia was going to look like. We had a constitution for Bosnia. We understood how Bosnia would remain within its international borders, but would be decentralized, essentially with two major entities or provinces or states, whatever you want to call them, within Bosnia. We had a schedule for elections. We had the OSCE, European Security Organization, set up to supervise elections. We had NATO troops and other troops set to come in and keep the peace there. We had laid this all out. We went in to see Milosevic, not to talk about all this, because he already knew about all this. What we did was we summarized it in 2 minutes, and we said, and now there's something else we need to inform you about. We didn't discuss it, we didn't negotiate it with him, we informed him. We were not going to allow war criminals to participate in the future of the new Bosnian state. No role for Karadzic and these other war criminals. Well, Milosevic was furious. He said, "Oh, you're making heroes out of these people, and why are you doing this?" And we said, "Not negotiable. We cannot set up a new Bosnia where war criminals are going to play a role in the future." And so Milosevic thought for a second, looked at all the stuff on the table, the new constitution, the territorial arrangements, the election supervision, all of this, and said, "Okay. What if we stopped talking about personalities like Assad today and started talking about what the political arrangements should be in Syria in the future?" And once we got to some agreement on that, at that point you might get into, frankly, Mr. Assad should not be part of this. And people would say, well, gee, we've got all this done, and there's this little part that we disagree. Got it. So I think we have really done it wrong, and the reason we've done it wrong is our administration has been pushed and pushed and pushed to be morally pure and diplomatically wrong about how to go forward. The trouble with some of the morality issues, the trouble with some of the legal issues, as any lawyer will tell you, lawyers look back, diplomats try to look forward. Sometimes you can't go forward unless you have a peek behind you, of course. But I think there has been an entirely misunderstood concept in the United States that the international community, or the world out there, exists as a place to show how tough we are. Frankly, it exists as a place to show how wise we can be and to show what wise leadership can do in a very troubled world. Thank you very much.